There's a question buried inside the oldest bones ever found in the Americas. A question that does not have a simple answer. A question that scientists have spent more than a century arguing about in quiet laboratories and at the edges of windswept excavation sites. And the question is this: who were the first people to arrive on a continent that had never known a human footstep? And were they, in any meaningful biological or ancestral sense, the same kind of people who live in the Americas today? The answer, when you approach it slowly and honestly and with the patience the question deserves, is far more complicated than most people have been taught. And that complexity is worth sitting with tonight. It is worth letting settle into you like the last light of a long afternoon. For most of the 20th century the answer seemed settled. Schoolbooks printed it with confidence. Museum displays illustrated with neat arrows and clean maps. The story went something like this. Sometime between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, a group of people crossed a land bridge, connecting what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. Walked southward through a corridor of ice, and became the ancestors of every indigenous person who ever lived in North and South America. These people were called the Clovis people, named after a town in New Mexico where their distinctive stone tools were first discovered in the 1930s. The Clovis people, according to this story, were the first Americans. They came once from one place, and everything that followed came from them. It was a tidy story, and like most tidy stories about very ancient and very complicated things, it was not entirely true. What has emerged over the past several decades, through advances in ancient DNA analysis, through the discovery of sites that predate Clovis by thousands of years, through the careful re-examination of skeletal remains that have been sitting in museum storage for generations, is a picture that is far richer and far stranger, and far more humbling than anything the textbooks contained. The first Americans were not a single wave of a single people. There were multiple arrivals from multiple directions over a period of time so vast that it strains the ordinary imagination to hold it. And some of those earliest arrivals, the people who left the first traces of human presence in the Western Hemisphere, appear to have been ancestrally distinct from any living population on Earth today. Not a different species in the strict biological sense, but different enough genetically and morphologically to raise profound questions about who they were, where they came from, and what happened to them. Tonight we are going to sit with that question. We are going to move through it slowly, the way water moves through ancient stone, wearing it down grain by grain, revealing what's underneath. If we look deeper into the geological record of the Americas, we find a continent that was, for most of its recent history, completely empty of human beings. The Americas are geologically ancient, shaped by forces operating over hundreds of millions of years, but the human story here is startlingly short. For all but the last sliver of geological time, no human hand ever touched the rocks of the Andes or the soil of the Amazon basin or the dark peat of the Mississippi Delta. No human eye ever watched the sun set over the Pacific coast of what would one day be called California. No human child ever learned to walk on the grasslands of the Great Plains. The Americas were, in this sense, the last great empty space on Earth, available to human colonization. By the time humans arrived here, they had already been living in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. They had spread across Europe and Asia and Australia. They had learned to survive in deserts and jungles and Arctic tundra. They had developed language and ritual, and the capacity to make art that could outlast a single human life. But the Americas remained untouched. The two great land masses of the Western Hemisphere sat in their oceanic isolation, full of megafauna that had never learned to fear a human silhouette, full of resources that no human hand had ever extracted, waiting in a silence that would last until the very end of the Pleistocene. The reason the Americas were settled so late, relative to the rest of the world, is primarily geographical. To reach the Americas from Asia, the route that most researchers believe was taken by at least the majority of early arrivals, you had to get past the Bering Sea. During periods of glacial maximum, when sea levels dropped because so much of the world's water was locked up in enormous ice sheets, the shallow continental shelf between Siberia and Alaska became dry land. This land bridge, which researchers call beringia, was not a narrow strip of beach. It was a vast subcontinent, stretching nearly 1,000 miles from north to south at its widest extent, covered in grasses and shrubs, home to woolly mammoths and bison and horses and other large animals. People could live in beringia. Archaeological evidence suggests that they did for thousands of years, before any of their descendants moved further east into the Americas. But to understand the first Americans, you have to understand something important about beringia. It was not simply a road, it was a place. People did not walk across it in an afternoon. They lived there across many generations, and while they lived there, they changed. They adapted to the cold, to the specific plants and animals of that high-latitude environment, to the particular rhythms of an Arctic world. The population that eventually moved into the Americas was already, in important ways, different from the populations that had originally migrated out of northeastern Asia. The conventional model, the one that dominated scientific thinking for most of the 20th century, imagined this population as essentially uniform. One group, one migration, one founding event. But the genetic evidence that has accumulated over the past 2 decades tells a different story. It tells a story of multiple lineages, multiple founding populations, and deep divisions within the ancestral gene pool that cannot be explained by a single migration event. From an evolutionary perspective, the genetics of modern indigenous Americans are consistent with a primary founding population that diverged from northeastern Asian populations sometime between 23,000 and 20,000 years ago, spent a period of isolation in Beringia or somewhere adjacent to it, and then expanded rapidly into the Americas sometime after 17,000 years ago. This is the lineage that accounts for the majority of indigenous American ancestry, but it is not the only lineage. And the story of the other lineages is where things become genuinely strange. In 2015, a team of geneticists studying indigenous populations in the Amazon basin discovered something unexpected. Certain populations in the Amazon, including groups like the Surui and the Caritiana of Brazil, showed a genetic signal that was not consistent with northeastern Asian ancestry. Instead, their DNA contained traces of a lineage more closely related to indigenous Australians, to the Yonge people of the Andaman Islands, and to certain populations in Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea. This lineage, which the researchers called Population Y, after the Tupi word for ancestor, appeared to represent a distinct founding population, separate from the primary lineage that populated most of the Americas. It was as if, alongside the main wave of migration from northeastern Asia, there had been another founding event involving people with a completely different ancestry. This was not a small or marginal finding. It was published in the journal Nature and subjected to intense scrutiny. The signal was real. The question was what it meant. One interpretation is that population Y represents a second migration into the Americas by a group of people who had a different ancestry from the primary, found population. This group might have arrived by a different route, perhaps along the coast of the Pacific Ocean, island hopping or travelling by boat through waters that are now submerged. This interpretation is supported by the fact that the population Y signal is found primarily in South America, particularly in Amazonian populations, rather than in North America, which might suggest that this group arrived separately and independently. Another interpretation is that population Y represents a very ancient shared ancestry that predates the divergence of the populations we are comparing. On this view, the genetic similarity between Amazonian peoples and Australians is not evidence of a direct connection, but rather a trace of an ancient common ancestor from which both groups diverged before the Americas were populated. The puzzle on this interpretation is not how a population related to Australians got to the Amazon, but rather why this ancient genetic signal survived in some populations and not others. Neither interpretation is fully satisfying, neither can be ruled out on the current evidence, and that is precisely what makes the question so interesting to sit with. We are looking at a pattern in ancient DNA that points towards something we do not fully understand, something that happened a very long time ago in a part of the world where the archaeological record is fragmentary and the genetic sampling still incomplete. But the genetic puzzle is only one part of the story. The other part involves the shapes of skulls. In the early decades of the 20th century, physical anthropologists studying skeletal remains from early Americans noticed something puzzling. The oldest skeletons found in the Americas did not look like modern Native Americans. They had different cranial shapes. Their skulls were longer and narrower, their faces more projecting, their brow ridges more pronounced. These traits are called, in the technical language of physical anthropology, dolichocephalic, meaning long-headed, as opposed to the more rounded or brachycephalic skulls characteristic of later populations in the Americas. At the time, these observations were sometimes used to support deeply racist theories about racial hierarchy, and the displacement of inferior races by superior ones. That history is ugly and important to acknowledge, but the underlying morphological observation, stripped of its racist framing, was real. The oldest American skulls do look different from later ones, and the question of what that difference means is a legitimate scientific question. One of the most famous examples is a skull known as Luzia, discovered in a cave in Brazil in 1975 by the French archaeologist Annette Laming-Ombeye. Luzia is the oldest human skeleton ever found in the Americas, dating to approximately 11,500 years ago. When researchers studied her skull, they found that it had morphological features more similar to African and Australian populations than to modern Native Americans or Northeastern Asians. Her face was narrow, her skull long, her features projecting. She did not look like the ancestor of the people who live in the Amazon today. The discovery of Luzia sparked enormous controversy. Some researchers interpreted her skull as evidence that the Americas were first populated by a people related to Australians or Africans who arrived before the main wave of migration from Asia. Others argued that her skull simply represented normal human variation, that the range of skull shapes in early human populations was wider than we tend to assume, and that reading too much into a single skeleton was methodologically unsound. Still, others pointed out that skull shape is a poor proxy for ancestry, that it can change rapidly in response to diet and environment and developmental conditions, And that molecular evidence is far more reliable than morphological evidence for reconstructing population history. The molecular evidence, as we've seen, does support the existence of a distinct ancestral lineage in some South American populations. Whether that lineage is related to Lutzia, whether the skull morphology and the genetic signal are pointing at the same historical event or at different events, remains unclear. What is clear is that the story of the first Americans is not the story of a single founding population that arrived 15,000 years ago and spread uniformly across 2 continents. It is a story of multiple arrivals, multiple ancestries, and a deep human past in the Americas that we are only beginning to understand. To appreciate what this means, it helps to think about the timescales involved. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been anatomically present on Earth for somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 years, based on the most recent fossil discoveries in Morocco. For most of that time, the species was confined to Africa. The expansion out of Africa began somewhere between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, with multiple waves of migration moving into the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and eventually Australia. By 60,000 years ago, there were humans in Australia. By 40,000 years ago, there were humans across most of Eurasia. But the Americas remained empty until perhaps 20,000 years ago at the earliest, and the major colonization of the 2 continents appears to have happened after 17,000 years ago. This means that of the roughly 300,000 years of modern human history, humans have been in the Americas for less than 10% of that time. The Americas are, in geological and evolutionary terms, an extremely recent addition to the human world. And yet the human history that played out here, across those 17,000 years, was extraordinarily rich and complex and varied, encompassing hundreds of distinct cultures, dozens of language families, civilizations of remarkable sophistication, and ecological adaptations to every conceivable environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to high-altitude plateau. That richness did not come from a single founding event. It grew from multiple roots, from the interaction of different peoples arriving at different times, with different ancestries and different cultural traditions, shaping each other, and being shaped by the vast and various landscapes of 2 continents. If we look deeper into the archaeological evidence, we find traces of human presence in the Americas that push the story back further than the conventional model would allow. The site of Monte Verde in southern Chile, excavated by the American archaeologist Tom Dillahay beginning in the 1970s, contains evidence of human occupation dating to approximately 14,500 years ago. This alone was enough to challenge the Clovis first model, because Monte Verde is located at the southern tip of South America, thousands of miles from the ice-free corridor through which the Clovis people were supposed to have entered the continent. For humans to be in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas significantly earlier than the Clovis model allowed, and they must have travelled south much faster than foot travel through an ice-free corridor would permit. The most plausible explanation is that they travelled by boat along the Pacific coast, moving from resource-rich coastal area to resource-rich coastal area, long before the ice sheets retreated enough to open an inland route. But Monte Verde is not even the oldest site. In recent years, evidence has emerged from several locations suggesting human presence in the Americas as far back as 30,000 years ago, or possibly even earlier. A site called Chiquihuit Cave in Mexico, reported in the journal Nature in 2020, contains stone tools in stratigraphic layers dating to between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago. If these dates are correct and they have been contested, there were humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, a period when the great ice sheets were at their most extensive, and the conventional land bridge crossing would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. Similar claims have been made for sites in Brazil, in South Carolina, and in other parts of the Americas. Not all of these claims have withstood scrutiny. The identification of stone tools is a notoriously difficult business, because rocks can fracture in ways that resemble human tool-making without any human involvement. And the dating of organic material found in association with possible tools is only meaningful if the tools and the organic material were actually deposited at the same time, which is not always easy to verify, but taken together, the growing body of evidence for pre-Clovis occupation of the Americas suggests that the conventional model was not merely incomplete, but fundamentally wrong in its chronology. The Americas were not first colonized 15,000 years ago. They were colonized earlier, perhaps much earlier, by people whose identity and ancestry we do not yet fully understand. From Earth's evolutionary perspective, this matters for a reason that goes beyond mere chronology. The longer humans were in the Americas before the Clovis expansion, the more time there was for distinct lineages to develop, for founding populations to diverge from one another, for the genetic and morphological diversity that we see in the skeletal record to accumulate. If humans arrived in the Americas 30,000 years ago rather than 15,000 years ago, there was twice as much time for the Americas to develop its own internal human diversity before the Clovis people and their descendants spread across the continent. And if different groups arrived at different times, by different routes, with different ancestries, the picture becomes richer still. The Americas might have been home, in the deep past, to several distinct human lineages, each with its own history, each representing a separate chapter in the global story of how Homo sapiens came to inhabit the entire planet. This raises an uncomfortable question, one that researchers have been careful about but cannot entirely avoid. What happened to those early populations? If there were people in the Americas before the main Clovis expansion, people with different ancestries and different morphologies, where'd they go? Why do modern indigenous Americans appear to be predominantly descended from the main Clovis-related founding population, with only traces of other ancestries surviving in a few isolated groups? There are several possible answers. One is that the early populations were small, and their traces were largely overwritten by the much larger and more rapidly expanding Clovis-related populations. The main founding population that crossed into the Americas sometime after 17,000 years ago may have been more numerous and more technologically effective than any earlier arrivals, allowing them to spread rapidly and absorb or displace smaller populations that were already there. In this scenario, the genetic traces of the earlier populations survive in some modern groups, because those groups were in regions where the Clovis expansion was less complete, where the earlier population managed to persist and eventually intermix with the newcomers. Another possibility is that the earlier populations were already gone by the time the main founding population arrived. The Americas experienced dramatic environmental changes at the end of the Pleistocene, including the extinction of the megafauna, significant shifts in vegetation, and changes in sea level that submerged coastal areas that had previously been inhabited. Small, isolated populations in a rapidly changing environment are vulnerable, They can disappear quickly, leaving behind only traces in the genetic record of later populations who moved into areas they had vacated. A third possibility, the most speculative and the most fascinating, is that some of the early populations survived long enough to interact directly with the expanding Clovis-related peoples, and that the result of that interaction was genetic admixture that is now difficult to detect because it was diluted over many generations. On this view, the population Y signal found in Amazonian peoples is not a trace of a separate migration, but a trace of admixture between the main founding population and an earlier group that was already present in South America when the main expansion arrived. We do not yet have enough data to distinguish between these possibilities with confidence. The ancient DNA record from the Americas is still sparse. Most of the skeletal material that could provide ancient DNA is too fragmentary or too poorly preserved for successful extraction. The ethical and legal frameworks governing the study of indigenous skeletal remains are complex and contested, reflecting the painful history of how these remains were collected and studied in the past. Progress is slow, careful, and appropriately cautious, but progress is being made, and what it reveals piece by piece is a past of extraordinary depth and complexity. Let us think for a moment about what it would have been like to be among the first humans to set eyes on the Americas. Not the main wave of migrants who arrived after 17,000 years ago, but the earlier arrivals, the ones whose traces we glimpse in the genetic and skeletal record, the ones who may have reached this continent in the deep darkness of the last ice age. Imagine a group of perhaps a few dozen people moving along a coastline that no longer exists, submerged now beneath hundreds of feet of cold Pacific water. They are travelling in small watercraft, perhaps dugout canoes or skin boats, hugging the shore, moving from one rocky headland to the next, catching fish and gathering shellfish and hunting the marine mammals that cluster on the ice edge. Behind them, to the north and west, is the world they have always known. Ahead of them is a coastline that stretches further than any of them can imagine, a coastline that curves southward across latitudes they have never experienced, into warmer air and different vegetation and a sky full of unfamiliar stars. They do not know they are entering a new continent. They have no concept of continent. They know only that the coastline continues, that there is food here, that this place is livable. They make camp in a sheltered cove, build a small fire, eat what they have caught, sleep close together against the cold. In the morning, they move on. Generation after generation, this process repeats. Children grow up in places their parents had never seen. Grandchildren move into valleys and river systems that no human being has ever explored. The continent opens before them, slowly, over hundreds of years, offering grasslands rich with game, rivers full of fish, forests dense with fruit and nuts and the animals that feed on them. They learn, through long experience, what is edible and what is not, which plants heal and which harm, how to read the sky and the water, how to survive in conditions that become more varied and more challenging as they move further south and further east. All of this happened in the absence of any other human beings. There was no competition from other groups, no conflict over territory with established populations, no need to negotiate or fight for access to resources. The Americas, for the people who first arrived here, must have felt like a world without limits. Every valley, every river, every stretch of coastline was available. Every ecosystem was unoccupied. Every resource was unclaimed. From an evolutionary perspective, this situation, a small population expanding rapidly into a vast and empty landscape, is exactly the kind of scenario that produces rapid genetic divergence. When a small founding group colonizes new territory and expands quickly, genetic drift operates powerfully, causing the new population to diverge from its parent population faster than it would in a stable, large population. Different subgroups settling in different regions would have diverged from each other at the same time. Over thousands of years, the result would be a set of distinct populations, each carrying a somewhat different sample of the genetic variation present in the original founding group. This is one reason why the indigenous peoples of the Americas, despite their common ancestry, are so extraordinarily diverse in language and culture and physical appearance. They are not diverse because they had many different origins. They are diverse in part because a small founding population expanded rapidly into an enormous landscape, and the subgroups that settled in different regions diverged from each other over thousands of years. But diversity of that kind, divergence from a common ancestry, is different from the kind of diversity that would result from multiple independent founding events involving populations with different ancestries, and the genetic evidence for population Y for a distinct lineage in Amazonian peoples that is not consistent with Northeastern Asian ancestry suggests that the simple divergence model is not the whole story. The whole story involves something more complex and more interesting. It involves the possibility that the Americas were visited in the deep past by more than one founding group, from more than one part of the world, by more than one route. And the traces of those multiple founding events are still present faintly in the DNA of living people. There is something humbling about this. We think of human history as something that happens in the late, in the documented present, in the realm of written records and preserved artifacts. But the deepest history, the history of how our species spread across the planet and filled every habitable corner of the earth, happened long before writing, long before agriculture, long before any of the institutions and technologies that we associate with civilization. It happened in the dark, in the sense that we have only the faintest traces of it, in old bones and ancient genes and the tools that survived in the earth long after the hands that made them had returned to dust. And yet the traces are there. The signal is in the DNA. The shapes are in the skulls. The dates are in the stratigraphic layers of ancient sediment. And slowly, carefully, with ever more sophisticated tools and ever more rigorous methods, scientists are reading those traces and reconstructing a story that is far richer and far stranger than anything we had imagined. Let us turn now to the skeletal evidence in more detail, because it is worth understanding what those old bones actually tell us and what they do not tell us. The study of human skeletal morphology, the shapes and proportions of bones, has a long and troubled history. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, physical anthropologists used skull measurements to sort humans into racial categories, and those categories were used to justify colonial violence, slavery, and genocide. The science was bad, the ethics were worse, and the legacy of that period continues to shape debates about how skeletal material should be studied and who has the right to study it. But the underlying observation that human populations differ in certain skeletal characteristics, and that those differences can sometimes be used to infer population history, is not itself invalid. The problem was not the observation, but the interpretive framework applied to it. The assumption that skull shape maps neatly onto racial categories, and that racial categories reflect fixed biological types. Modern researchers understand that skull shape is a complex trait influenced by many factors, including genetics, diet, developmental environment, and chance. It is not a reliable indicator of racial identity, and should not be used to sort people into rigid categories. What it can do, with appropriate statistical methods and appropriate caution, is help researchers identify broad patterns of population history. When you look at a large sample of skulls from a particular time and place, and compare them to a large sample of skulls from other times and places, you can sometimes detect patterns of similarity and difference that reflect population relationships. This is not racial categorization. It is population genetics by another method, with all the limitations that implies. The pattern that emerges from such analyses when applied to the oldest American skeletons is consistent and puzzling. The oldest skulls, including Luzia from Brazil, Penon woman from Mexico, and several other specimens from South and Central America, dating to before 10,000 years ago, tend to have long, narrow skull shapes, projecting faces, and other features that are more commonly associated with populations from sub-Saharan Africa and Australia than with modern Native Americans or Northeastern Asians. The researchers who've studied this pattern most carefully, including the Brazilian physical anthropologist Walter Neves and his colleagues, argue that it reflects the ancestry of a founding population that was distinct from the main Northeastern Asian founding population. On their interpretation, the Americas were first colonized by a group of people descended from an early dispersal out of Africa, a group that had not yet acquired the skull-shaped characteristics associated with East Asian populations. This group arrived in the Americas before the main Northeastern Asian wave and established the initial human presence here. They were then largely absorbed or replaced by the later, more numerous Northeastern Asian migrants. But their skeletal traces survive in the oldest burial sites. Not all researchers accept this interpretation. Some argue that the morphological differences between early and late American skulls can be explained by microevolutionary change within a single founding population, without invoking multiple migrations. Others point out that the morphological method is too imprecise to draw firm conclusions about population history. The debate continues. But what is striking, from the perspective of someone trying to understand the full human story of the Americas, is the convergence between the morphological evidence and the genetic evidence. Both point independently toward the existence of a founding population or populations in the Americas that were ancestrally distinct from the main Northeastern Asian founding lineage. The morphological evidence comes from the shapes of the oldest skulls. The genetic evidence comes from the DNA of living populations in the Amazon. Neither line of evidence taken alone is conclusive, but together they suggest something real. The Americas, in the deep past, may have been home to a human population, or populations whose ancestry reached back through a different branch of the human family tree than the branch that produced most modern Native Americans. Not a different species. Homo sapiens, fully modern in their biology and their cognitive capacities, but different in the sense that matters for understanding human history, different in ancestry, different in origin, different in the particular path they had taken across the ancient world before they arrived at the edge of the continent that no human being had ever seen. To understand how different human populations can become, even within a single species, it helps to think about the deep history of Homo sapiens as a whole. When modern humans first spread out of Africa, roughly 60,000 to 80,000 years ago, they moved into a world that was already inhabited by other hominin species. In Europe and Western Asia, there were Neanderthals. In Eastern Asia, there were Denisovans. In Southeast Asia, there may have been remnant populations of Homo erectus. These were not the same species as Homo sapiens, and yet, as ancient DNA analysis has revealed, the interactions between them and modern humans were not purely competitive, there was interbreeding. Modern humans outside Africa carry small but detectable amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 4%. Indigenous Australians and some other Pacific populations carry Denisovan DNA. Some African populations may carry traces of DNA from archaic hominins that have not yet been identified from fossils. These findings have transformed our understanding of human evolution. The story is not one of a single, pure lineage expanding outward and replacing all other forms of humanity in a clean sweep. It is a story of contact, exchange, hybridization, and absorption, a story in which the boundaries between populations and even between species were more permeable than anyone had imagined. The first Americans lived in a world where these boundaries were, in relative terms, quite recent. The last common ancestor of all modern human populations lived only a few 100,000 years ago. The divergence between northeastern Asian populations and the populations that gave rise to Australians and Papuans happened somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, these are not enormous spans of time, but they are long enough. In a species that reproduces relatively slowly and lives in small isolated groups, for substantial genetic and morphological differences to accumulate, when we ask whether the first Americans were a completely different species, we are asking a question that is simultaneously too dramatic and not quite dramatic enough. Too dramatic because they were clearly Homo sapiens, fully capable of interbreeding with any other modern human population, carrying the same basic genetic architecture, the same fundamental cognitive capacities, the same range of emotional and social behaviours, not a different species in any strict taxonomic sense, but not quite dramatic enough, because the differences that existed between these early populations and the populations that eventually dominated the Americas were real and meaningful. They reflected tens of thousands of years of separate evolution. They reflected different histories, different environments, different pressures and adaptations, and they raise a question about human history that goes beyond the Americas. How many times, in how many places, has the arrival of a new and more numerous population effectively erased an earlier population from the historical record, leaving only faint traces in the genes of the people who came after? The answer, we now know, is many times. The pattern that may have played out in the Americas, an earlier, smaller population absorbed or displaced by a later larger wave of migration, is one that recurs throughout human prehistory. In Europe, the first modern humans who arrived around 45,000 years ago were largely replaced, genetically speaking, by waves of migration from Anatolia and the Eurasian steppe that came later, during and after the Neolithic period. In South Asia, the original hunter-gatherer populations were largely absorbed by later farming populations. In East Asia, similar patterns of replacement and admixture have been documented through ancient DNA analysis. Human prehistory, from this perspective, is not a story of stable populations sitting in their territories across thousands of years. It is a story of movement, of expansion and contraction, of populations replacing and absorbing one another in ways that leave traces detectable only by the most sensitive modern techniques. The world was always in motion. People were always moving. The Americas, because they were the last major landmass to be colonized, represent the final chapter of that global story. And because the colonization happened relatively recently, in evolutionary terms, and because the Americas were truly empty of other hominins when the first humans arrived, The story here is in some ways cleaner and more legible than elsewhere. There were no Neanderthals to interbreed with, no Denisovans to absorb. The only hominins were Homo sapiens, and the question is simply which groups of Homo sapiens arrived here, when, and by what routes. The answer, as we have seen, is not simple. It involves at least two and possibly more distinct founding populations, arriving by at least two different routes, over a period of time that may span tens of thousands of years. It involves a main northeastern Asian founding lineage that accounts for the majority of modern indigenous American ancestry, and at least one other lineage, possibly related to Australasian populations, whose traces survive in some Amazonian peoples. It involves skeletal evidence from the oldest burial sites that is inconsistent with northeastern Asian ancestry, and points toward an even older founding population whose genetic traces may be too diluted in modern populations to detect with current methods. And it involves the sobering possibility that some of those founding populations disappeared almost entirely, leaving no living descendants, remembered by no oral tradition, known to us only through the shapes of skulls and the ambiguous curves of stone tools in ancient sediment. Let us sit with that possibility for a moment. It is one of the quieter tragedies of deep history, the disappearance of populations so ancient that even their names are unknown, populations that walked the forests and coastlines of the early Americas for generations, that developed languages and songs and stories that are now gone without a trace. They had inner lives as rich as ours. They experienced joy and grief and fear and wonder. They watched the stars and listened to the rain and taught their children the names of things. And then they were gone, absorbed into larger populations, or simply dwindled away in a changing world. And the only evidence that they ever existed is the particular shape of a woman's skull in a cave in Brazil. There is a deep lesson in this about the fragility of human cultures and the scale of what has been lost across the span of prehistory. Written history preserves only the most recent sliver of human experience. The vast majority of human cultures, the languages, the stories, the ways of understanding the world that accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens existence, are gone. Not preserved, not even recoverable, simply gone. This is not a cause for despair. It is a cause for a kind of reverence. The people who left those first footprints on the shores of the Americas were doing what humans have always done, moving into new territory, adapting to new conditions, trying to survive and reproduce and build a life in whatever circumstances they found themselves. They were, in the deepest sense, us. And the fact that we can now, through the patient work of geneticists and archaeologists and physical anthropologists, glimpse the outlines of their existence, even if only faintly, is a remarkable thing. It means that they are not entirely gone. They live in the DNA of the Suri and the Caritiana. They live in the curve of Lutia's skull. They live in the stone flakes at the bottom of a cave in Mexico, dated to 30,000 years ago. They live, in a sense, in us. It's in the long chain of human movement and the adaptation and survival that connects every living human being to every other. Back to the first members of our species standing on the plains of Africa, looking outward at a world that had not yet been touched by human hands. In early human environments, the experience of encountering new landscape for the first time was probably not experienced as a grand historical event. There was no sense of discovery in the modern meaning of that word, no consciousness of participating in a momentous human achievement. There was only the landscape itself, the immediate demands of hunger and cold and shelter, the need to learn quickly what this new place had to offer, and what it might take from you. The people who first walked into the Americas were deeply practical. They had to be. The environments they entered, whether coastal tundra or temperate rainforest or open grassland, required specific skills and knowledge that could not be carried from home but had to be developed through direct experience. Which berries were safe to eat? Where did the fish run in summer? How deep did the snow get in winter? And how long did it last? How did the large animals of this place behave? And what were the most effective ways to hunt them? These were not abstract questions. They were questions of survival, and the people who answered them correctly left descendants, and the people who answered them incorrectly did not. Over generations, the accumulated answers to these questions became cultural knowledge, transmitted from parent to child, encoded in language and practice and ritual, the body of expertise that made survival possible in a particular place. The diversity of indigenous American cultures, the hundreds of distinct languages, the dozens of distinct subsistence strategies, the enormous variety in social organization and material culture and religious practice, is the result of thousands of years of this process playing out in thousands of different environments across two enormous and varied continents. It is one of the great intellectual and cultural achievements of our species, this adaptive radiation of human cultures across the Americas, and it happened in a relatively short time, in evolutionary terms, from a founding population that was itself already highly capable and culturally sophisticated. But it did not begin cleanly or simply. It began in the murky, difficult-to-see past of the late Pleistocene, with small groups of people making their way along submerged coastlines and through Ice Age landscapes, carrying with them the seeds of all the cultures that would eventually flourish here. And some of those small groups, the ones that left the faintest traces, the ones that arrived earliest or came from the most unexpected directions, may have been ancestrally distinct from the people who eventually became the majority population of the Americas. To understand the full significance of this, consider the timeline more carefully. If the Chiquihuite cave dates are correct, there were humans in Mexico 30,000 years ago. The main founding population of the Americas, the one ancestral to most modern Native Americans, arrived sometime between 17,000 and 15,000 years ago. This means that, when the main founding population arrived, the Americas may already have been inhabited, at least sparsely, for more than 10,000 years. The people already here, the pre-Clovis inhabitants, had had 10,000 years to adapt to the environments of the Americas, to develop their own cultural traditions, to spread across at least some portions of the two continents. 10,000 years is an enormous span of time. It is longer than the entire span of recorded human history. It is long enough for significant cultural and genetic divergence. It is long enough, potentially, for the pre-Clovis people to have diversified into multiple distinct populations with distinct identities and traditions. What happened when the main founding population arrived, moving south along the coast or through the opening inland corridor, is something we can only speculate about. Did the newcomers and the established populations meet? Did they trade? Did they fight? Did they interbreed? Did the newcomers simply move into areas that were unoccupied, filling in the vast empty spaces that even 10,000 years of sparse pre-Clovis habitation had left untouched? The genetic evidence suggests that if there was interbreeding, it was limited. The main founding lineage, the one that accounts for most modern Native American ancestry, appears to be relatively homogeneous, without strong signals of admixture from an earlier population. But limited interbreeding is not the same as no interbreeding. and the population was signal suggests that somewhere in South America a different story played out, one involving more substantial mixing between the main founding lineage and an earlier or differently arrived group. It is also possible, and this is worth considering, that the pre-Clovis people were not widely distributed. If they arrived by boat along the Pacific coast, they may have been primarily coastal populations, living in a narrow band along the shoreline that is now underwater. The main founding population, arriving later, may have moved primarily inland, occupying territories that the coastal people had never reached. The two populations might have existed in relative isolation from each other for a long time, separated not by hostility, but simply by geography, by the fact that they had adapted to different environments and had no particular reason to seek each other out. If this is what happened, the eventual mixing, when it occurred, may have been a slow, gradual process rather than sudden confrontation. Coastal populations and inland populations might have interacted at river mouths and estuaries, where the two environments meet. Over generations, the genetic boundaries between the two would have blurred, with each absorbing some of the other's ancestry, while the larger, more numerous inland populations gradually became demographically dominant. This kind of gradual demographic absorption is one of the most common ways that population differences get erased in human prehistory. It does not require violence or displacement. It requires only that one population is larger and growing faster than the other, so that over many generations the genetic contribution of the smaller population becomes diluted to the point where it is barely detectable. The people descended from the smaller population do not disappear. They are still there, still living, still contributing to the community. But their ancestry becomes, over time, a small fraction of a much larger and more diverse gene pool. The Amazonian peoples who carry the population X signal are, on this interpretation, the descendants of a community where that dilution never quite went to completion, where the pre-Clovis ancestry survived in a detectable form because the community remained somewhat isolated from the main gene pool, or because the initial admixture was high enough that even after many generations of further mixing, the signal remains above the threshold of detection. This is, it should be acknowledged, a speculative story. It is consistent with the available evidence, but not uniquely demanded by it. Other interpretations remain possible. The field is young, the evidence is fragmentary, and the history we are trying to reconstruct happened a very long time ago, under conditions that left few traces. Every confident statement about the first Americans should be held lightly, with an awareness that new evidence could revise it fundamentally. But that uncertainty is not a weakness of the science. It is an honest acknowledgement of the difficulty of the problem. And the problem is genuinely difficult because we are trying to reconstruct the movements and interactions of small groups of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago, who left no written records, whose cultural artifacts have mostly disappeared, and whose biological remains survive only partially and often in forms that are difficult to study. What we can say with confidence is that the first Americans were not who we used to think they were. The Clovis first model, with its clean and simple story of a single founding event 15,000 years ago, is gone. In its place is something more complicated and more interesting. A picture of the Americas as a land that was entered from multiple directions, possibly at multiple times, by groups of people with different ancestries and different histories, whose interactions and interminglings over thousands of years produced the rich diversity of indigenous American cultures. And in that picture there is room for the possibility, supported by both genetic and morphological evidence, that some of those early arrivals were ancestrally distinct enough from the main founding population that their presence in the Americas represents a genuinely separate chapter in the global story of human dispersal, not a different species, but a different branch of the human family, a branch that reached the Americas by routes and at times that we are still working to understand, and that left traces of its passage in the DNA of the people who live today in the forests of the Amazon. From an evolutionary perspective, this is precisely what we should expect. Human populations have been moving and mixing and diverging and mixing again for hundreds of thousands of years. The pattern in the Americas, multiple founding populations, differential survival of ancestral signals, gradual demographic absorption of smaller groups by larger ones, is the same pattern that played out on every other inhabited continent. The Americas are not exceptional. They are the most recent example of a process that is as old as our species. But because they are the most recent, and because the founding events happened close enough to the present that some of the genetic signals have not yet been fully erased, the Americas offer us a window into that process that we do not have for older colonization events. We can see, in the DNA of living Amazonian peoples, the trace of a founding population whose identity is still debated but whose existence is real. We can see in the shapes of skulls from the oldest American burial sites the morphological signature of people who did not look like the ancestors of most modern Native Americans. We can see in the dates from Chiquihuit Cave and Monte Verde and other early sites the outlines of a human presence in the Americas that is older and stranger and more complex than the textbooks ever suggested. All of this is still being worked out. The science is ongoing. New sites are being discovered, new ancient DNA is being extracted and analysed. New statistical methods are being developed for interpreting morphological variation. Every year the picture becomes a little clearer, a little more detailed, a little closer to the truth. And the truth, as best we can currently see it, is this. The Americas were first settled by human beings whose identity we do not fully know, coming from directions we cannot entirely trace. At times we cannot precisely date. They were followed by larger and more numerous populations from northeastern Asia, who became the demographic majority and whose descendants populate most of the indigenous Americas today. And somewhere in that long history of arrival and movement and mixing, the traces of the earliest arrivals were largely erased, preserved only in the ambiguous evidence of old bones and ancient genes, and the patient work of scientists trying to read the past. It is a story without a clean ending. It is a story that is still being told, and that perhaps is exactly as it should be. Let us think for a moment about what the Americas looked like when those first people arrived. Because part of understanding the human story of these continents is understanding the landscape into which those first people walked, or paddled, or ran. The Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, were a world very different from the one we know. The ice sheets that had covered much of North America were retreating but still enormous. Vast glaciers clung to the mountain ranges of the west. The Great Lakes were still forming, carved by retreating ice. Much of what is now Canada was buried under ice hundreds of meters thick. The sea level was lower than today, exposing continental shelves that are now underwater, creating coastlines that do not appear on any modern map. But below the ice, the Americas were teeming with life. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, the assemblage of large animals that had evolved over millions of years without any exposure to human hunters, were present in extraordinary abundance. Mammoths grazed the grasslands of what is now the American Midwest. Mastodons browsed in the forests of the east. Ground sloths, the size of elephants, moved through the forests of South America. Glyptodonts, armadillo relatives as large as small cars, trundled across the pampas. Giant condors soared over the Pacific coast. Horses and camels, both originally North American species, roamed in large herds across the open grasslands. Dire wolves and saber-toothed cats, the apex predators of this world, hunted in the shadows. All of this was gone within a few thousand years of human arrival. The end Pleistocene extinction event, one of the most dramatic mass extinctions in the history of the past 65 million years, wiped out most of the large animals of the Americas within a relatively short span of time. Whether this extinction was primarily caused by human hunting, by the rapid climate changes at the end of the Pleistocene, or by some combination of the two, is still debated. But the correlation between human arrival and megafaunal extinction is striking, and most researchers now believe that hunting played a significant role. The implications of this are profound. The Americas that the first human arrivals encountered were ecological worlds of extraordinary richness and complexity, full of large animals that had no instinctive fear of bipedal predators. These animals, having evolved in the absence of human hunters, would have been relatively easy to hunt. A small group of skilled human hunters, armed with spears, moving into this naive megafauna, could potentially have killed large numbers of animals in a short time, more than enough to drive population declines in species that reproduce slowly. The first Americans, whoever they were not passive observers of this landscape. They were active participants in it, reshaping it through their hunting, their fire use, their movement. The extinction of the megafauna was one of the most significant ecological events in the history of the Americas, and human beings, those first small groups of arrivals from across the sea or across the ice, were almost certainly a significant cause. This does not diminish those first Americans. They were doing what humans have always done, using the resources available to them, applying their intelligence and their skills to the problem of survival. They could not have known that they were contributing to a global-scale ecological transformation. They could not have known that the animals they hunted were not replenishing themselves fast enough to sustain the level of predation being applied to them. They were living in the present, as all animals must, responding to immediate conditions rather than long-term consequences. But the long-term consequences were real. Within a few thousand years of sustained human hunting, the great megafauna of the Americas was gone. The mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths and glyptodonts and horses and camels were extinct. The ecological niches they had occupied were empty. The grassland ecosystems that had been shaped by their grazers were transformed. The predator assemblage that had preyed on them was decimated. This was the world that later arriving populations, the main northeastern Asian founding lineage and its descendants, inherited. A world already changed by whoever had come before. A world from which the great megafauna had largely vanished, forcing the new arrivals to develop different subsistence strategies, to rely more heavily on smaller game, on fish, on plant foods, on the diverse array of resources that the post-Pleistocene Americas had to offer. In this sense, even if the earliest pre-Clovis populations left few genetic traces in modern Americans, they left an enormous ecological legacy. The world the Clovis people and their descendants encountered was already a post-megafaunal world, a world shaped by 10,000 or more years of human presence. The very conditions that Clovis hunters faced, the kinds of animals available to hunt, the structure of the vegetation, the distribution of water and other resources were already different from what they would have been in a world without any prior human presence. History, even the deepest and most remote history, is always downstream of something. Every human population that ever existed was shaped by the populations and events that came before, even when those populations left no names, no stories, no monuments. The first Americans who left enough traces to be detected by modern science were themselves, preceded by others whose traces are fainter still. And those earlier others were shaped by the histories that preceded them, reaching back through tens of thousands of years of human movement across the old world, back to the original dispersal from Africa, back to the populations on the African savanna where our species first appeared. This is what it means to understand human history at the deepest level. It means following the thread of connection backward through time, through the silence of the prehistoric past, through the faint signals in ancient DNA and the ambiguous evidence of stone tools and old bones, to the place where the thread disappears into a darkness we cannot fully illuminate. But we can illuminate a little, and every year we illuminate a little more. The question posed by this story, were the first Americans a completely different species, has a nuanced answer, as the best questions usually do. They were not a different species. They were human beings, fully modern, fully capable, sharing the same fundamental biology as every other person alive today. But they were different in ways that matter, different in ancestry, different in history, different in the particular path their forebears had taken across the ancient world, and some of them left traces that are still detectable, faint but real, in the genes and the bones and the stones of the deep American past. The Americas, when you look at them through this lens, become a place of enormous historical depth. Not just 15,000 years of human history, as the old textbook stories suggested, possibly 30,000 years or more. Not just one founding population, but multiple. Not just one migration route, but several. Not just one ancestral story, but a braided narrative of multiple peoples and multiple origins, multiple chapters in the long human project of spreading across the earth. And at the beginning of the narrative, before the main wave of migration, before the Clovis expansion, before the development of the rich diversity of indigenous American cultures that existed at the time of European contact, there were people, small groups perhaps, sparse populations certainly, people whose names we do not know, whose languages are gone, whose stories survived only in the memories of people who are themselves now gone. But people, human beings, the first ones to see this place. From an evolutionary perspective, there is something deeply fitting about this. The history of our species is a history of movement, of always going further, of crossing the water and climbing the mountain and walking into the valley that no one from your group has ever walked into before. The first Americans, whoever they were, and however they got here, were the culmination of that drive. The people who completed the human project of inhabiting the planet, who found the last great empty space and made it home. They were the end of one story and the beginning of another. The story of how humans came to fill the earth was finished when those first feet touched the shores of the Americas. And the story of the Americas, with all its complexity and richness and tragedy and wonder, began. We are still in the middle of that second story, but we are learning slowly and carefully to read the first chapter, the one written not in words but in bones and genes and the shapes of ancient stones. And the more we read it, the more we understand that the first Americans were not simple, what uniform were not the clean beginning that the old textbook stories suggested. They were complex, various, multiplied, ascended, shaped by histories that stretched back across the entire span of the human world. They were, in short, fully human as any of us, as human as anyone has ever been. The darkness before the historical record is not empty. It is full of people, and some of those people were here, in the Americas, long before anyone used to think, coming from places we're still trying to identify, by roots that are still submerged beneath the sea. They were the first, and in some faint but real sense they are still here, in the shape of a skull, in a strand of ancient DNA, in the quiet persistence of evidence that refuses to be entirely erased. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the weight of the day dissolve, think for a moment about those first arrivals. Think about what it meant to walk into a world that no human being had ever seen. Think about the particular quality of silence in a place without human memory, a forest that had never heard a human voice, a coastline that had never been watched by human eyes. And think about how that silence was broken, how it was broken by the sound of human feet on a pebbled shore, by the crackle of a fire built in a new place, by the voices of people talking in a language that is now gone, telling each other things that we will never know. That is where the American story begins. Not with a clean migration from Siberia 15,000 years ago, but in this deep, complicated past of the late Pleistocene, with people we are still trying to understand arriving in ways we're still trying to trace, at times we're still trying to date. The question is still open. The research is still going, and the bones in the earth are still waiting to tell us more. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the question sit with you, quiet and unresolved, the way the best questions always do. The Americas are old in human terms, older than we knew, and their first inhabitants were real and various and fully human. Whatever they were us. Rest now. The story will still be there in the morning. There is another dimension to the story that deserves careful attention, one that is often left out of popular accounts of the first Americans, and that is the dimension of language. The languages spoken in the Americas at the time of European contact were among the most diverse on Earth. Linguists identified somewhere between 150 and 250 distinct language families in the Americas, a number that dwarfs the diversity found on any other continent. By comparison, all of Europe's languages belong to only a handful of families. Most of them relate to each other through the common ancestor known as Proto-Indo-European. The Americas, with their extraordinary linguistic fragmentation, present a picture of human diversity that is almost impossible to explain if the continent was populated by a single founding group only 15,000 years ago. This raises an important question. How do you get from a single founding language, or even a small number of founding languages, to more than 150 distinct language families in 15,000 years? The answer is that it is, in fact, possible. Languages diverge rapidly when populations are separated from one another. Even after a few thousand years of isolation, the languages of two related groups can become so different that they are no longer mutually intelligible, and share so few cognates that their relationship is difficult to detect. After 10,000 years of separation, the original relationship can become effectively invisible without the most sophisticated methods of historical linguistics. But the number of distinct language families in the Americas is so large, and the diversity within those families so deep, that some linguists have argued it is more consistent with a longer period of occupation or multiple separate founding events than with a single migration 15,000 years ago. The American linguist Joseph Greenberg proposed in the 1980s that all American languages could be grouped into three large families: Amerind, Naden, and Eskimo-Aleut. On his interpretation, these three families reflected three separate migrations into the Americas, corresponding roughly to three waves of migrants from Asia. This proposal was controversial and has been largely rejected by specialists, who argue that the internal diversity of Amerind is too great for it to constitute a valid genetic unit. But the underlying intuition that the linguistic diversity of the Americas points toward a long and complex history of human occupation remains influential. From an evolutionary perspective, language diversity and genetic diversity often travel together. Populations that have been separated for a long time tend to diverge both linguistically and genetically. If the Americas were home to multiple founding populations with distinct ancestries, we would expect those populations over thousands of years to develop distinct languages that would eventually give rise to distinct language families. The extraordinary linguistic diversity of the pre-contact Americas may therefore be in part a reflection of the deep and multiple origins of the American founding populations. This connection between language and ancestry is complicated, because languages can spread independently of genes. The population can adopt the language of another group through contact, trade, intermarriage, or conquest, without necessarily sharing the ancestry of the group whose language it adopts, but in the absence of the kind of intensive contact that leads to language replacement, populations tend to maintain their languages across many generations, and the historical relationships between languages can serve as a rough proxy for the historical relationships between the populations that spoke them. The Americas, before European contact, were not a world of intensive contact in the way that, say, the Mediterranean basin was. Large portions of the continent were occupied by relatively small, relatively isolated populations that had a limited contact with groups more than a few hundred miles away. In such a world, languages would have diverged steadily over thousands of years, producing the extraordinary diversity that linguists encountered when they began systematically recording American languages in the 18th and 19th centuries. If that diversity is indeed a product of deep time, it adds another piece to the puzzle of the first Americans. It suggests that the human history of the Americas is not only genetically and morphologically complex, but linguistically complex as well, a complexity that points toward a longer occupation and a more varied set of founding events than the conventional model allowed. Let us turn now to consider the geography of the Americas more carefully, because geography played a crucial role in shaping the human history of these continents in ways that are easy to underestimate. The Americas are, by any measure, enormous. The distance from the northern tip of Alaska to the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego is roughly 9,000 miles. The continental landmass includes every major climate zone on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, from high-altitude desert to temperate grassland, from mangrove coast to alpine meadow. The mountain ranges, particularly the Andes in South America and the Rockies in North America, create dramatic environmental gradients over short, horizontal distances. The great river systems, the Amazon, the Mississippi, the Orinoco, the Parana, the Columbia, the Colorado, provide corridors of movement and communication that cut across the mountain barriers. This geographical diversity had profound implications for the people who lived here. Different environments required different technologies. different social organizations, different subsistence strategies, different knowledge systems. A people adapted to the cold and the relatively sparse resources of the northern tundra would find the humid heat and overwhelming biological productivity of the Amazon basin a fundamentally different world, one requiring entirely new skills and new ways of living. The adaptive radiation of human culture across the Americas was, in part, a response to this geographical diversity, a process by which a small number of founding populations gave rise over many generations to a vast array of distinct cultures, each tuned to the particular demands of its environment. But geography also shaped the history of the Americas in a more direct way, by determining which areas were accessible to early settlers and which were not. The presence of enormous ice sheets covering most of Canada during the last glacial maximum meant that for much of the period when the Americas might have been first colonized, the interior of the continent was impassable. The only viable routes would have been coastal routes, either along the Pacific coast or, if the timing was right, through a narrow ice-free corridor that appears to have opened in the interior of Canada sometime after 15,000 years ago. The coastal route hypothesis, which has gained considerable support over the past 2 decades, proposes that the first Americans made their way south, not through the interior, but along the Pacific coast, travelling in small boats from headland to headland, exploiting the rich marine resources of the coastal zone. This route was available even during the last glacial maximum, because the Pacific coast south of Alaska was not fully glaciated. There were stretches of ice-free coastline interspersed with glaciers that reached the sea that would have required boat travel to navigate. But for people who are already skilled coastal mariners, these obstacles would not have been insurmountable. The coastal route hypothesis is supported by several lines of evidence. First, the ages of the oldest well-documented American sites, including Monte Verde in Chile, are more consistent with a coastal migration than with an interior one. A coastal migrant moving southward along the Pacific coast could have reached the southern tip of South America in a few thousand years. Given the abundance of resources along the coast and the relatively rapid movement that boat travel enables, an interior migrant moving through the ice-free corridor would have taken much longer to reach South America, because the corridor opened later, and because overland travel through unfamiliar terrain is slower than coastal travel. Second, the genetic evidence for early American founding populations is consistent with a coastal origin. The genes of modern Native Americans show patterns of diversity that are consistent with a southward expansion along the Pacific coast, with greater diversity in populations near the coast and less diversity in populations far inland. This is the pattern we would expect if the founding population entered from the north along the coast and spread southward, with each successive founding group carrying a subset of the diversity of the previous one. Third, and most suggestively, the ancient coastal environments that would have been used by a coastal migration are now largely submerged. Sea levels at the end of the last glacial maximum were more than 100 meters lower than today, meaning that the coastline of the period was far further from today's shore than the current coast. The sites where early coastal migrants camped, gathered shellfish, and built their fires are now beneath the ocean, inaccessible to archaeologists without the most sophisticated underwater excavation techniques. The absence of early coastal sites in the archaeological record is not evidence that there were no early coastal migrants. It may simply be a consequence of the fact that their world is now underwater. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the study of the first Americans. The most important evidence may be permanently beyond our reach. The coastlines that the first migrants travelled, the campsites where they stopped, The middens of shells and fish bones that would tell us what they ate and how they lived are gone, buried under 100 meters or more of cold Pacific water. We can study the genetics of their descendants. We can study the morphology of the oldest surviving skeletons. We can study the dates from the oldest inland sites. But the direct evidence of the coastal migration itself, if it happened, may never be recovered. This uncertainty is part of what makes the question of the first Americans so compelling and so enduring. We are trying to reconstruct a history from fragments, and the most important fragments are missing. What we are left with is a picture assembled from indirect evidence, from genetics and morphology and archaeology and linguistics. A picture that is suggestive but incomplete, that points toward something but cannot definitively confirm it. And yet the picture that emerges from this incomplete evidence is, in its own way, magnificent. It is the picture of our species doing what it does best: moving, adapting, exploring, persisting. Moving across ice and water and unfamiliar terrain, generation after generation, until every habitable corner of the planet had been found and occupied. Finding ways to live in environments that seemed, at first encounter, hostile and forbidding. Building cultures of remarkable richness and complexity out of the raw materials of new landscapes. Leaving traces, however, faint that can still be read tens of thousands of years later, by the descendants of people who arrived on the other side of the planet long after those first footprints were made. This raises an important question about how we should think about human diversity. The first Americans, whoever they were not racially or biologically inferior or superior to any other human population. They were, as we have emphasized, fully modern Homo sapiens, carrying the same fundamental human capacities as anyone alive today. The differences between them and other human populations were differences of history, of the particular path their ancestors had taken, of the environments they had adapted to, of the cultures they had developed. These differences were real and meaningful, but they were not differences in kind. They were differences in the particular expression of a shared humanity. The history of the study of the first Americans has been in part a history of the misuse of difference. The morphological differences between early American skulls and modern Native American skulls were used in the 19th and early 20th centuries to support racist theories about racial replacement and racial hierarchy. The genetic differences between different indigenous American populations were used in the 20th century to support theories about the relative primitiveness of some groups compared to others. These misuses were not minor errors. They had real consequences for real people, and their effects are still felt in the communities whose ancestors were the subjects of this research. It is important then to be clear about what the evidence actually shows and what it does not show. The evidence shows that the human history of the Americas is complex, that it involves multiple founding populations with different ancestries, that some of those populations have left more traces in the modern gene pool than others, and that the earliest settlers of the Americas may have been ancestrally distinct from the dominant population that eventually came to occupy most of the continent. None of this implies anything about the relative worth or capability of any human group. All of these populations were fully human. All of them were doing what humans do. All of them deserve to be understood on their own terms as actors in a vast and complex historical drama, not as specimens in a racial taxonomy. The complexity of the first American story is in fact a reminder of something that all good science eventually teaches. The world is more complicated than our models of it. The clean story of a single Clovis migration was satisfying in its simplicity. But simplicity in the face of genuine complexity is not a virtue. It is a failure of understanding. The more complicated story that has emerged over the past several decades, with its multiple founding populations and its diverse ancestries and its contested dates and its submerged evidence, is harder to hold in the mind but closer to the truth. And the truth, as we have seen, is a story of remarkable human achievement. The first people to arrive in the Americas, whoever they were, accomplished something that had never been done before, and that would never be done again in the same way. They found a world that no human being had ever seen, and they made it their own. They did it without the benefit of accumulated knowledge about the new continent, without maps or guides, without any cultural tradition of how to live in such a place. They did it through intelligence, adaptability, and the deep human capacity for learning and cultural transmission. They did it, in short, the way humans have always done the hardest things, imperfectly, gradually, with many failures and setbacks, but ultimately triumphantly. If we look deeper at the specific environmental conditions of the late Pleistocene Americas, we begin to appreciate just how demanding those conditions were. The end of the last ice age was not a smooth transition from cold to warm. It was a period of dramatic and sometimes rapid climate change, with temperature swings of several degrees occurring over decades or centuries, with the sudden drainage of enormous glacial lakes creating floods that dwarfed anything in recorded history, with the reorganization of vegetation zones that forced animals and people to adapt on timescales that were short even by humans' generational standards. The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for roughly 1,200 years, was one of the most dramatic of these climate events. Average temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere dropped by several degrees within a few decades, reverting much of the landscape to near-glacial conditions after a period of relative warming. The effect on human populations in the Americas, who were just beginning to spread across the continent, would have been severe. Food resources would have shifted dramatically. The range of animals suitable for hunting would have changed. The distribution of edible plants would have been disrupted. How the early Americans responded to the Younger Dryas is difficult to know, because the archaeological record is sparse and the dating is imprecise. But the fact that human populations survived and continued to diversify throughout this period suggests that they were already highly adaptable, already capable of shifting their subsistence strategies in response to changing conditions. The cultural flexibility that allowed humans to colonize such a diverse range of environments in the first place was the same flexibility that allowed them to survive the instabilities of the late Pleistocene climate. This adaptive flexibility was not random. It was built on a foundation of accumulated cultural knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can only be developed over many generations of close observation of the natural world. The first Americans, like hunter-gatherer peoples everywhere, were extraordinarily knowledgeable about the natural environments they inhabited. They knew the seasonal patterns of plants and animals, the distribution of water and shelter, the signs of approaching weather, the tracks and behaviors of game. This knowledge was the product of thousands of years of accumulated observation and experience, transmitted across generations through language and practice. And as they moved into new environments, they had to build this knowledge from scratch. Every new valley, every new river system, every new forest or grassland required a new body of knowledge, developed through direct experience and transmitted to the next generation. The process was slow and the cost of error was high, but it worked because natural selection favoured the people who learned most quickly and adapted most successfully, and the cultural traditions that accumulated in each new environment reflected the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had lived there before. This is, in a sense, what culture is. It is the accumulated knowledge of a population stored not in genes but in language and practice and memory, and available to every member of the group regardless of their individual learning. It is the human alternative to genetic adaptation, faster and more flexible because it can be updated within a single generation rather than across many. The cultural diversity of the pre-contact Americas was the product of thousands of years of this process, playing out in thousands of different environments, producing thousands of different solutions to the fundamental human problems of how to survive and how to live well. And at the foundation of all of this cultural diversity at the very beginning of the American story were the first people, the ones who arrived when the continent was empty, who had no cultural tradition to draw on for guidance in this new world, who had to learn everything from direct experience. They are the ones whose traces we are still trying to find, whose ancestry we are still trying to understand, whose story we are still trying to tell. There is one more thread worth following in this story, and that is the thread of oral tradition. Many indigenous American peoples have traditions that speak in various ways about origins, about migrations, about the coming of the first people to the land. These traditions have not always been taken seriously by academic researchers, who have sometimes dismissed them as mythology rather than history. But there is growing recognition that oral traditions, carefully interpreted, can preserve genuine historical information across many generations. Some indigenous oral traditions in the Americas speak of a time before the current world, a time of great cold and darkness, a time of enormous animals, a time when the land itself was different. These traditions are consistent in broad outline with the geological and climatic conditions of the late Pleistocene. They speak of migrations, of long journeys, of the finding of new lands. They speak of encounters with other peoples, sometimes described as strange or different, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as allies. Whether these oral traditions preserve genuine memories of the first migrations into the Americas, memories transmitted across hundreds of generations of storytelling, is impossible to verify with certainty. The time spans involved are enormous, and the distortions introduced by centuries of retelling are difficult to estimate. But the possibility cannot be dismissed. There are documented cases of oral traditions that have preserved accurate information about geological events such as volcanic eruptions and tsunamis across thousands of years. If oral tradition can preserve the memory of a volcanic eruption for 10,000 years, it might also preserve in transformed and symbolic form the memory of the first arrival in a new land. If it does, then the story of the first Americans is not entirely lost. It lives, in fragmented and transformed form, in the stories that indigenous peoples have been telling for as long as anyone can remember, in the songs and ceremonies and narratives that were nearly destroyed by 5 centuries of colonial violence, and are still being preserved and revitalized by the communities that inherited them. Those stories are not merely mythology, they are a form of historical knowledge, accumulated and transmitted across generations, encoding in symbolic form the experiences of people who lived in a world we can barely imagine. To take those traditions seriously, to listen to them with the same attention we give to the genetic data and the archaeological evidence, is to add another dimension to our understanding of the first Americans. It is to acknowledge that the people who lived here had their own ways of knowing and remembering their past, ways that are different from, but not inferior to, the methods of academic science. It is to recognize that the story of the first Americans is not only a scientific question, but a human one, belonging not just to researchers in laboratories, but to the communities whose ancestors are being studied. This recognition is part of what has changed in the study of the first Americans over the past several decades. The field has become more collaborative, more attentive to the perspectives and concerns of indigenous communities, more cautious about the ethical dimensions of studying human remains and human history. This is not a concession to sentiment at the expense of science. It is a recognition that the best science is done in dialogue with the communities most directly affected by its findings, and that the first Americans were real people whose descendants are still here and still have a stake in how their ancestors are understood. The story of the first Americans is, in the end, a story about all of us. It is a story about the human capacity to move into the unknown, to survive in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, to build cultures and communities and ways of life out of the raw material of a new world. It is a story about the deep unity of our species, the fact that all of us, wherever we live and whatever our ancestry, are descended from the same small African population that gave rise to all of modern humanity. And it is a story about the remarkable diversity that our species has achieved within that unity. Thousands of ways of being human that have flourished across the surface of this planet over the past 300,000 years. The first Americans were part of that diversity. They were a chapter in the long human story, a chapter written in the deep past, in the language of bones and genes and stone tools, and the ancient sediment of vanished lake beds. We are still learning to read that chapter. We may never read it completely, but what we have already read is extraordinary, and what remains to be read is more extraordinary still. The Americas were the last great chapter of human expansion across the planet. They were the end of the road, in the sense that after the Americas were colonized, there was nowhere left on Earth that human beings had not yet reached. The planet was full. The great adventure of filling the world, which had begun hundreds of thousands of years earlier in Africa, was complete. And it was completed by people we are still trying to understand, people whose bones are older than civilization, whose languages are gone, whose faces we can only glimpse in the shapes of ancient skulls, whose ancestry we can only trace in the faint signals of old DNA. They were the first, and they deserve to be remembered, even if we do not yet fully know who they were. The science will continue. New ancient DNA will be extracted from new skeletal specimens, and the picture of the first American founding populations will become clearer and more detailed. New archaeological sites will be discovered, some of them perhaps older than anything known today, pushing the story further back into the Pleistocene darkness. New statistical methods will be developed for interpreting morphological variation and for detecting the faint genetic signals of ancient founding events. New collaborations between researchers and indigenous communities will produce new insights and new ways of understanding the past. And slowly, across the years and decades, the story of the first Americans will come into focus. Not perfectly, not completely, not without gaps and uncertainties, but enough to honour the people whose story it is, enough to understand, in rough outline, how the Americas came to be home to one of the most diverse arrays of human cultures the world has ever known, enough to appreciate the depth and complexity of the human history of two continents that most of the world used to think had a simple and recent beginning. That history is neither simple nor recent. It is deep and complex and still being revealed, and every revelation brings us a little closer to the people who began it, standing at the edge of an unknown world, not knowing what lay ahead, moving forward anyway. That is, in the end, what humans do. We move forward. We always have. We always will. And on this night, as you rest and let the day dissolve, somewhere beneath the forests of the Amazon, the DNA of the Surui and the Caritiana carries a signal that is more than 15,000 years old. A signal from people who came from a direction no one fully understands, who arrived at the edge of a continent that had never known a human footstep, and who made it, for a time, their home. The signal is faint, but it is there, and it is speaking to anyone patient enough to listen about the deep and complicated and ultimately human story of how the Americas came to be inhabited. Close your eyes. Let it be enough to know that the story is there, in the bones and the genes and the sediment and the stone, waiting quietly for the next careful pair of hands and the next careful mind to find it and understand it a little better than we do today. The first Americans were real. They were here, and in some small but irreducible sense they are still here. That is enough for tonight, to hold in the mind as sleep comes. There is a particular quality to the silence of very ancient places that anyone who has spent time near archaeological excavations will recognize. It is not the absence of sound exactly, it is more like the presence of time, a thickness in the air around the sediment layers, around the careful brushwork revealing something that has not been touched for thousands of years. Researchers who work in such places often speak of it, sometimes with embarrassment, as though they know it sounds unscientific. But the feeling is real. The feeling is of being in the presence of something that has outlasted comprehension. At the site of Monte Verde in southern Chile, that feeling must be particularly acute. Here, preserved in the waterlogged peat that accumulated along a small creek 14,500 years ago, are the remains of a place where people lived, not just passed through, lived. There are the post holes of structures, small huts or shelters arranged along the creek bank. There are the remnants of hearths, the charred wood and ash of fires that burned when woolly mammoths were still alive on the other side of the continent. There are the bones of the animals that were eaten here, the seeds of the plants that were gathered, the stone tools that were made and used and left behind. And there are traces of medicinal plants, plants that grow not near Monteverde but hundreds of kilometers away, plants that had to have been gathered and carried to this place by someone who knew their properties and travelled to find them. This last detail is worth sitting with. The people who lived at Monteverde were not simply surviving. They were not simply hunting and gathering in the immediate vicinity of their camp. They were travelling, trading perhaps, maintaining connections with other groups far away. They had knowledge of plants that grew in distant places and the motivation to acquire them. This is not the behaviour of a species barely clinging to existence in a harsh new world. This is the behaviour of a sophisticated, well-organised, culturally rich people who had been in its land long enough to develop an intricate relationship with its resources. How long had they been there? The site dates to 14,500 years ago. But the level of cultural sophistication visible at Monteverde suggests a people who had been in the Americas for considerably longer than that, who had had time to explore the land and learn its plants and animals and seasons, to develop the social networks and the cultural traditions that the site implies. Tom Dillehay, who spent decades excavating the site under conditions of considerable controversy, has suggested that the people of Monteverde may have been descendants of populations that arrived in the Americas much earlier, populations whose traces are still being sought. Below the main occupation level at Monteverde, there's a layer of sediment that contains what may be stone tools and other artifacts dated to approximately 33,000 years ago. This lower layer is more contested than the upper one. The interpretation of the objects as human-made tools is disputed. But if the interpretation is correct, the implications are staggering. It would mean that humans were in southern Chile 33,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, at a time when the conventional model says the Americas were still empty of people. Whether or not the lower Monteverde layer represents a genuine human presence, the question it raises is one that the entire field is now grappling with. Is the human history of the Americas even older than the pre-Clovis sites that are now well documented? Is there a layer of human presence in the Americas that is so old and so sparse that we've barely begun to find its traces? This is not an idle question. If humans were in the Americas 30,000 years ago or more, they were there during a period of extreme environmental stress, a period when the ice sheets were at their maximum extent and the climate was harsh and unstable. They would have had to be extraordinarily adaptive, capable of surviving in environments that would challenge even the most well-equipped modern expedition. Their populations would have been small and their traces correspondingly faint, but small populations leave some traces, and the traces, when found, raise questions that cannot be ignored. The site of Xiquihuit Cave in Mexico is one such trace. The stone tools found in its deepest layers, dated to between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago, are simple but consistent in their morphology. Their edges worked in ways that natural fracturing does not typically produce. The dating of the organic material associated with these tools has been done carefully, using multiple methods and multiple samples. The researchers who published the finding were aware of the controversy it would generate and took pains to document their methodology thoroughly. The response from the scientific community was exactly what the researchers expected. Skepticism, alternative interpretations, calls for replication. This is how science should work. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the claim that humans were in Mexico 30,000 years ago is certainly extraordinary. But the skepticism should not be allowed to become a reflex. The history of American archaeology is full of claims that were initially dismissed and later vindicated. The Monteverde dates, when first published, were dismissed by many researchers as impossibly old. Today they are accepted as well established. The lesson of that history is not that all extraordinary claims should be accepted, is that the default assumption, the assumption that Americas were first colonized recently and by a single founding population, should not be held so firmly that it prevents the careful evaluation of evidence that points in a different direction. The evidence for very early human presence in the Americas is still fragmentary and contested, but it exists, and it deserves to be taken seriously. In early human environments across the world, the pattern of human expansion was rarely clean or simple. It was usually a process of advance and retreat, of small pioneering populations moving into new territory, sometimes establishing themselves and sometimes failing, sometimes leaving descendants and sometimes not, with the traces of failed or temporary occupations disappearing without a clear record in the archaeological evidence. The colonization of the Americas, if it began earlier than the conventional model suggests, may have followed this same pattern, with one or more early pioneering populations establishing themselves in parts of the Americas before the main founding event, living through harsh periods and periods of relative plenty. Their populations fluctuating with the climate, their genetic traces surviving in some places and not others. On this view, the conventional model is not entirely wrong. There was indeed a major founding event sometime around 17,000 years ago, involving a large population from northeastern Asia, whose descendants eventually populated most of the Americas. But this event did not happen in an empty landscape. It happened in a landscape that already had people in it. People who had arrived earlier by different routes and who had been living in the Americas, sparsely and perhaps precariously, for thousands of years already. The interaction between these two populations, the established pre-Clovis people and the new arrivals from the north, is the missing chapter of the American story. We do not know what form those interactions took. We do not know whether they were peaceful or violent, cooperative or competitive, brief or extended. We do not know how much genetic exchange occurred, or over what timescale. We know only that the genetic and morphological traces of the earlier populations are faint in the modern record, suggesting that new arrivals eventually became demographically dominant, and that the earlier populations were either absorbed or largely displaced. But the traces are there, faint, contested, ambiguous, but there, and they speak, however indistinctly, of a human presence in the Americas that is older and more complex than anyone used to believe. This complexity is, in the end, one of the most beautiful things about the human story. We're a species that does not fit neatly into simple narratives. Our history is too long, too varied, too full of contingency and accident, and the particular genius of individual populations for any simple story to capture it fully. Every time we think we've understood some part of our past, new evidence comes along to complicate the picture, to add another layer of complexity to remind us that the world was never as simple as our model depicted. The first Americans are one of the best examples of this. For decades, the story seemed settled. Then the evidence began to accumulate, piece by piece, site by site, gene by gene, and the settled story dissolved into something richer and stranger and more human. Not resolved, not finished, not clean, but alive, ongoing, still being told by the bones and the genes and the stones. That aliveness, that ongoing quality of the inquiry is itself worth honouring. It means that the story is not over. It means that there are still discoveries to be made, still questions to be answered, still surprises waiting in the sediment of ancient lake beds and the cells of people living today in the forests of Brazil. It means that the first Americans are not lost. They are only not yet fully found, and on this quiet night, with sleep settling around you like water round a stone, that is perhaps the most comforting thought of all, that the past is not gone, that it is present all around us in the shapes of things and the codes of living cells, waiting patiently for us to learn enough to read it, that the first people who walked the Americas, whoever they were, are still here in some form, still part of the living world, still connected to the present by threads. Too fine to see with the naked eye, but strong enough to bear the weight of all the questions we can ask about them. Sleep now. And let those ancient people rest too. Or in the quiet acknowledgement that their story matters, that it is being told, that it is not forgotten. The Americas were their home before they were anyone else's home. And knowing that, holding it gently in the mind as the night deepens, is its own kind of reverence. The first Americans were real, or they were here. And in the word that all true things endure, they are still here. Let that be enough. It is worth taking a moment to think about what ancient DNA analysis actually is, and why it has so transformed our understanding of the first Americans over the past 2 decades. Because the technology is extraordinary, and the story of how it was developed is itself a quiet testament to the power of patient, careful, scientific work. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, the only biological evidence researchers had to work with was the physical shape of bones. You could measure a skull, describe its proportions, compare it to other skulls from other places and times, and draw inferences about population relationships. But these inferences were always uncertain, because skull shape is influenced by so many factors beyond ancestry that it is a poor proxy for genetic relationship. 2 skulls can look very similar because their owners were closely related, or because they eat similar foods, or because they lived in similar environments, or by chance. And 2 skulls can look very different for all the same reasons, even if their owners were closely related. Ancient DNA analysis cuts through this uncertainty. DNA is the actual code of inheritance, the sequence of chemical letters that is passed from parent to child, and that carries, embedded in its structure, the record of population history. By reading the DNA extracted from ancient bones and teeth, researchers can directly compare the genetic makeup of ancient individuals to each other and to modern populations, identifying relationships and divergences with the precision that morphological analysis can never achieve. The technical challenges of ancient DNA analysis are formidable. DNA degrades over time, broken into fragments by the action of water, acids, enzymes, and the ultraviolet component of light. The older a specimen is, the more degraded its DNA will be. And the warm, humid conditions that characterize much of the Americas are particularly destructive to A. Many American archaeological specimens, especially those from tropical or subtropical environments, contain no recoverable ancient DNA at all. The specimens that do yield ancient DNA are typically from coldy, dry environments, where the conditions are less favourable to degradation. The oldest ancient DNA from the Americas comes from specimens found in permafrost, caves, or other sheltered environments where the DNA has been partially protected from the most destructive processes. Even from these favourable specimens, the DNA that can be recovered is highly fragmented and contaminated with the DNA of bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that have colonized the bone over the centuries. The development of techniques for dealing with these challenges, for extracting and sequencing the tiny amounts of genuine ancient human DNA from specimens that are mostly contaminated with other material, took decades of work by researchers across several continents. The key breakthrough came in the first decade of the 21st century, with the development of next-generation sequencing technologies that allowed researchers to sequence millions of short DNA fragments simultaneously, making it possible to detect and assemble the genuine ancient human DNA, even when it constitutes only a tiny fraction of the total material in a sample. Since then, the field has advanced rapidly. Hundreds of ancient American genomes have been sequenced from specimens ranging from a few hundred to more than 10,000 years old. The picture that has emerged from this work is far more detailed and far more complex than anything that could have been imagined from morphological evidence alone. It shows a founding population with deep roots in northeastern Asia, diverging from Asian populations sometime between 23,000 and 20,000 years ago, spending a period of isolation in Beringia or somewhere adjacent, and then expanding rapidly into the Americas sometime after 17,000 years ago. But it also shows, in certain populations, the population Y signal, the trace of a founding lineage with a different ancestry, more closely related to Australasian populations than to Northeastern Asians, and it shows, in the patterns of genetic diversity across the continent, a history of population movements and replacements that unfolded over thousands of years after the initial colonization. A history in which the founding populations of different regions were sometimes replaced or substantially diluted by later migrations. One of the most striking findings from ancient DNA analysis of the Americas is the evidence for a major population replacement in North America roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. For researchers have found that the ancient genomes of individuals from this period in certain parts of North America are quite different from the genomes of individuals who lived in the same regions a few thousand years earlier. This suggests that a new population with different ancestry moved into these areas and largely replaced the populations that had been living there. The identity of this new population and the cause of the replacement are still being investigated, but the finding underscores the point that the human history of the Americas was not a story of stable populations persisting unchanged across thousands of years. It was a story of movement and change and replacement, playing out over timescales that are hard for us to intuit. This pattern of replacement is not unique to the Americas. Ancient DNA analysis of European populations has revealed a similar pattern, with the original hunter-gatherer populations of post-glacial Europe being largely replaced, first by farmers from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, and then by pastoral people from the Eurasian steppe around 5,000 years ago. The genetic makeup of modern Europeans reflects these successive waves of replacement and admixture. The original European hunter-gatherers who painted the caves of Altamira and Lascaux and left their handprints on the walls of Chauvet contributed only a small fraction of the ancestry of modern Europeans. The Americas seen in this light are not exceptional. They are following the same pattern of population movement and replacement that seems to characterize the human history of every continent. The first arrivals are often, in the end, only the first of many, and the populations that eventually dominate any given region may be descended primarily from later arrivals rather than from the original pioneers. This is a humbling thought. It means that the people we celebrate as the founders of a place, the people who first arrived in a previously uninhabited land and began the process of human occupation there, are often not the primary ancestors of the people who live there today. Their genetic contribution may be diluted to near invisibility by the time we can study it. Their cultural legacy may be transformed beyond recognition by the cultures that came after. Their languages are gone. Their names are gone. Only faint traces remain in the DNA of a few isolated populations, in the shapes of old bones, in the dates from deep sediment layers. And yet they were real. They were here. They were the first to break the silence of this land with human voices, the first to build fires in its darkness, the first to teach their children the names of its rivers and its mountains and its animals. That matters, even if we cannot name them. That matters, even if we cannot fully reconstruct their story. In early human environments, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next was the most fundamental act of culture. A parent teaching a child which plants were safe to eat, where the water could be found in dry season, how to read the signs of approaching weather, was doing something that was at once utterly practical and profoundly human. That knowledge, accumulated and transmitted across hundreds of generations, was what allowed small founding populations to survive and grow, and eventually populate an entire continent. The first Americans, whoever they were, performed this act of cultural transmission countless times across thousands of years in thousands of environments, building the knowledge base that made human life in the Americas possible. Without them, without that long accumulation of learning and teaching and remembering, there would have been no Mayan civilization, no Inca Empire, no Cahokia, no Tenochtitlan, no rich diversity of cultures that existed when European ships first appeared on the American horizon. Everything that came after was built on the foundation they laid, the knowledge they accumulated, the land they learned and loved and passed on to their children. That foundation is not forgotten. It endures in the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples across the Americas, in the agricultural techniques and the ecological knowledge and the spiritual traditions that have persisted, sometimes barely, through 5 centuries of colonial destruction. It endures in the landscapes themselves, shaped by thousands of years of human management, human burning, human planting, human attention. It endures in the languages that are still spoken, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom of people who have lived in particular places for very long times, and it endures in the genes, in the faint signals that ancient DNA analysis is just beginning to detect, pointing back through the millennia to the people who were here first, the ones we are still trying to understand, the ones whose story is still being told. The Americas are not a new world. They are one of the oldest human worlds there is. Old enough that their first chapter is written in a language we are only beginning to learn to read. Old enough that the people who began the story are known to us only in outline, in the curve of a skull and the trace of a gene and the date of the stone tool. Old enough that the full story may never be recovered, that some of it is truly gone, dissolved by time and water, and the indifference of the physical world to the human dramas played out upon it. But not so old that the signals are entirely gone, not so old that the question is unanswerable, not so old that the people are unreachable. They are there, in the data, patient, waiting. Older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than any written word, but present still in the evidence that careful hands and careful minds keep uncovering year by year, site by site, gene by gene. The first Americans are waiting to be understood, and we are slowly beginning to understand them. That is enough on this quiet night to carry into sleep. The thought that the past is not lost, that the first people are not forgotten, that every year we know a little more, and every year the story grows a little richer, and every year the silence of the deep American past fills us slowly and beautifully with the shapes of lives that were real and complete and fully human, long before any of us were here to know about them. Sleep. The story will continue in the morning.